Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Scotty Horry, solo percussionist, drummer, and teacher from the United States and faculty at the Music School of Delaware. I'm also an endorsed performing artist and clinician for Sabian cymbals, Vickford sticks, Majestic percussion, and Mapex drums. Welcome back to my lecture series, Tools for the Journey. And here we are on our final lecture, which is entitled Stimulus, Concentration, and Cognitive Skills in the Present Day. And whether you're a student, a teacher, a parent, whether you have a job in music or outside of music, hopefully all of this will be encouraging and informative for you, especially as you plan and change your routines from day to day for a healthier lifestyle and to be a better global citizen in general. That's the real message and purpose of this lecture series. So, first of all, please understand here I have many citations at the end of this lecture in particular. Many of the statements I'm making are based on synthesizing these bits of information, and few of them are just personal opinion. So I do want you to check out the references at the end of this lecture. You can also see them in the description text. And we're going to talk about smartphone usage as well a lot in this lecture. You may want to review the applied neuroscience lecture before this one, as we're going to get in pretty great detail with the science with these particular topics. So let's get started with the subject matter. The brain is stimulated and conditioned by pretty much everything in our day-to-day lives. It's well understood that in the present day we have more competition for our attention than ever prior in our history, and we experience fragmented concentration. It's also well known that we have way more visual stimulus in general and busy visual stimulus in today's world, whether you're working in the digital space or even in person at a place like, let's say, for example, a shopping mall or an airport. And this is a statement made by the British neurologist John Stone, among many others. And over the past 4 or 5 years or so, I've worked with a lot of neurologists and functional neurologists and people in the applied neuroscience community. And it's been interesting to hear that many of them have told me that QEEG readings, which is a type of brain imaging, shows a lot of overactivity, namely in the gamma and beta waves. Now, what exactly does that mean? Generally speaking, in layman's terms, people are functioning on a high level of stimulus, overstimulus. And we're going to break down what exactly that means and how we measure it a little bit later. We're going to talk about smartphone and device usage a lot today, and social media usage, and cover why it can be risky to mental health and things like concentration skills, focusing skills, general cognitive ability, and the development of social skills. Smartphones, especially when they're overused, or device usage or platform usage or social media usage in general, has now been shown to be a part of the pathology that could potentially develop into ADHD. And attention and concentration is a group of skills, and anyone can develop and improve them, including focused attention and impulse control. And that's whether or not you may have a diagnosis of such neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD. It's a group of skills that require practice, just like anything, learning a foreign language or learning a motor skill, learning how to play a musical instrument. And there's specific brain areas that are correlates to that, which we'll cover a little bit later. So a term that I've started to use lately in my teaching and when I lecture about my topic, which is holistic awareness and mindfulness, is experience saturation. And I want to try to explain what I mean by that term. Experience saturation, somewhat of a philosophical idea. We need time to reflect on stimulus, ideas, and experiences with introspective reflection. More time with excess activation without this time to step back and reflect or to be at peace and silence or rest is related to sympathetic activation of the autonomic nervous system. So there's a biological correlate here. And of course, many, many illnesses, whether they be physical or psychiatric, have to do with sympathetic activation being upregulated or chronically active. And I would reference the applied neuroscience lecture to help you remember what sympathetic action of the autonomic nervous system is. And it's been linked, of course, or excess sympathetic activation has been linked to psychiatric illness, especially heart illness. And because they exist on a polarity, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are kind of you could think of it as a hot and cold type of system. And if there's too much sympathetic activation, as we covered in the applied neuroscience lecture, that means there's less time in parasympathetic states, or in layman's terms, restful, passive states. Okay, so we can see how this is a problem. Neurobiological framework of these types of problems I would describe as primary acetylcholine and the catecholamines, which are dopamine and epinephrine and norepinephrine, are all involved here. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter responsible for one-pointed focus and concentration, as well as motor movements and muscular contraction, as well as norepinephrine and epinephrine and dopamine, especially with the receptors in the frontal brain areas. And dopamine in particular is responsible for mediating reward and motivation in the brain. And of course, that can happen in small time frames and large time frames. So when we become fragmented with our concentration, or for example, distracted by pleasing things, like very short-lived pleasing things like YouTube videos we like, something coming up on our screen visually that might be appealing, like an advertisement, or for many of us men, perhaps a really attractive woman walking by, or see a cool car or something. That's something that will give you a quick dopamine response. The nucleus accumbens in the substantia nigra in the brain will produce a small amount of dopamine. And to the untrained mind, that can override your executive function, executive control. And it can override your behavioral inhibition and your impulse control. And of course, that's how a distraction happens. Now, the challenging thing about this is that dopamine, which is mostly responsible for motivation and motivation reward, as well as movement and goal seeking, is a chemical that needs to be at a baseline in your system. And it needs to have a healthy baseline, and it needs to slightly upregulate at just the right times. Now, when you engage in these sorts of distractions or short-lived pleasing things like the examples I just mentioned, there's relatively high levels of dopamine that get triggered for a very short amount of time. So it's sort of like eating junk food in a sense. So there's a small spike, and just like someone splashing, the bath water while taking a bath, slowly but surely, if they get enough of those spikes, the overall level of the water in the bathtub is going to go down. So dopamine, very much, it's been hypothesized, works the same way. So if we get these constant types of triggers that give us a small amount of positive emotion, small amount of motivation very quickly, or a very quick reward, or some people say instant gratification, what's curious is that over a longer period of time, the baseline dopamine goes down. And this is one of the biological correlates to the thesis statement here of my lecture today, which is that we need to be concerned about our level of stimulus and how it influences our concentration and cognitive skills. So what do we know about low dopamine levels? We do know that variations or irregularities, non-normative activity in the dopamine system is correlated with certain types of neurological and psychiatric illness. Of course, Parkinson's is the first one that comes to mind, which involves the brain's inability to produce adequate amounts of dopamine. ADHD has been linked to a dysfunction in the dopamine system. And by dysfunction, I mean it's low at the wrong times and it's high at the wrong times. It's been also suggested in literature that people with depression have generally lower levels of dopamine, or it could be that their dopamine receptors are less sensitive, or there could be wrong with the dopamine transporter system. There's a lot of complex reasons why that might happen, but we do know that dopamine has to be at a optimal level at the right times, and the baseline has to be consistent. Bipolar disorder is another one where we understand that there's gigantic spikes in dopamine that last for anywhere up to a day to 2 days, which can result, of course, in a crash later of mood and motivation. So we do understand in the literature, and again, I would like for you to look at my sources in the text at the end of this lecture, that smartphone usage, especially overusage, does create some type of destabilizing effect to these dopamine circuits and these reward, motivation, effort circuits. So those of you who are parents might have noticed that, and I speak to my parents of my students frequently about this, that if the child is overusing a device or high on screen time, they might be more apt to have tantrums or to have mood fluctuations or to have very low motivation when it comes time to do homework or chores. So all the time on screens, whether it's a iPhone or a smartphone, iPad, or laptop, is creating these dopamine triggers, taking it out of baseline. And things that will give you moderate, normal amounts of pleasure start to feel numb and give you less positive emotion. So this is frighteningly similar to the pathology we understand about addiction, is that when someone's addicted to something, say alcohol or something like pornography or sugar, that they frequently think of it as a way to provide positive emotion, and their seeking of that thing becomes very narrow, and actually there's less of an incentive to seek out positive emotion from other things. And we're starting to see that smartphone usage looks a lot like that. So the other thing about this chronic low-level stimulation of things like dopamine and epinephrine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine in the wrong circuits at the wrong times also means that there's not enough of the other side, and so it's an imbalance. So sometimes with health and wellness, it's not about taking away the bad things, it's also about lacking the good things. So obviously, if dopamine is too high at the wrong times, that means you will not be able to rest. And rest is very important for a functioning biological organism, especially a primate. And dopamine is associated with sympathetic action, sympathetic nervous system. And the other side, as I mentioned a moment ago, of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic. And that's associated with a lower level of dopamine for that particular 6 hours, 8 hours, and more of the neurotransmitters GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and serotonin, for example. And those need to be active in a balanced way to the others I mentioned. Now, the other thing is, this whole thing is a problem because when we have this chronic stimulation, we begin to access our frontal lobe less frequently, which is the most sophisticated part of the brain, which is responsible for executive function. And it's also responsible for attention and complex tasks, things that animals can't do as well. Things like long-term goal projection, the pursuit of an activity based on ethics and objectives. These sorts of things all happen in the frontal lobe. Let's talk about vision for a minute and how this plays into this whole discussion on the applied neuroscience of stimulation and attention and mood. Vision and action are strongly linked in the human brain, especially the male brain. Men are very visually oriented from a neurophysiological perspective. And in this example I'm illustrating of chronic stimulation, let's say with a smartphone, the brain is falling for the quick reward trick, and not the real experiences. or the delayed gratification, which is healthy behavior psychologically. And frontal control we can use to learn to suppress the less important actions that we instinctually would like to follow in pursuit of the more virtuous actions and long-term goals, which are sustainable, again, which are more related to the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and the executive function in particular, mostly coming from the anterior midcingulate cortex, which is the smaller brain area I spoke about in the prior lectures. So we're talking in this case about visual stimulus. Okay, let's take a moment and talk about flow states and repetition and relaxation and how those things work together and how they might provide a contrast to this stimulus overload experience that I'm referring to time and again here since we started today. So let's think about what it's like to listen to music. When you listen to music, you could be doing it actively or passively. And I think we can all relate to this experience, especially because hopefully many people listening are colleagues and friends and students of mine who are musicians. When you listen passively, you might be moving or doing something else. You might have the music in the background. It might just be kind of setting the mood or just taking up some space. When you listen actively, you're really noticing specific things. And I want you for a moment to think about the difference between those two experiences. Now, anything involving skills like manual labor or sports or playing a musical instrument, dance, there could be a state you enter after doing it for, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of flow. And in the neuroscience literature, we call this transient frontal inhibition. For some more cognitive things like doing research or working on a paper or reading, some people have now started to call this deep work. And some might argue that it's the new sort of gold. It's the new commodity for most optimal career success and health in the present day. Now, when you engage in something like social media or YouTube or TikTok, for example, the context switches up very fast. Now, that's very detrimental to building our focus and concentration skills, and it turns out in the literature that the brain gets very agitated with context switching. There's a lot of general cognitive ability upregulation when you can stay focused on one task for a longer period of time and engage in this flow state, like I'm saying, or deep work. Again, whether it's more skill-based or cognitive, it doesn't matter. The same principle applies. It's much better to enter moderately long periods of focus on one task without diverting or fragmenting your attention. And the brain naturally, especially the untrained brain, like that of a child or someone that, let's say, statistical case, not undergone an experience of good education or refining a skill or being accountable, the brain can be very sensitive to reacting to visual motion. And that's a very primitive instinct. That's a very, very old mechanism. And our brain does not work well with rapid context changes. It diminishes our ability to do meaningful work, complex projects, or finish responsibilities, for example. So the act of consciously controlling that temptation to look at a visual stimulus will fortify that executive function, and actually it will physically enlarge the anterior midcingulate cortex, which again is responsible for impulse control and all of that. So you can see how these behaviors become very important for your future. And nowadays, to sort of observe yourself and that of your children, your students, your colleagues, family, it's very easy to see that you can spend a lot of time achieving very little productivity, for example, let's say at the workplace. And you could also spend very small amounts of time achieving a lot if you divert your attention and focus in the right ways. So I often say to my students that people think of time very, very linearly, and time really doesn't work linearly at all. The quality of time, in fact, seems to be way more important. And in the case of behavior, And from a psychology and neuroscience perspective, it's what your experience looks like, the quality of your experience for that given amount of time, whether it's short by minutes and seconds and hours, or whether it's longer by those linear metrics. So what I'm saying is that it's very easy to waste a lot of time over the course of an hour nowadays with the direct accessibility of distraction. And it's entirely possible to be extremely productive in 15 minutes. So I'd just like for you to reflect on that and know that it's also consistent with the biology. So one thing I would suggest in that vein would be try to challenge yourself to read a full chapter of a book without any distraction. Perhaps listen to a full podcast in a flow state without turning it off, like if you have a long drive or a flight, for example, instead of just watching short clips or reading short excerpts from several different books that may be different from one another. Now, obviously, there's merit to both, but I would encourage you to observe what your experience is like when you place your attention on something for an extended period of time. This also helps us form deeper understanding and longer narratives of ideas versus simply gathering small bits of data which may or may not be correlated in a logical way in order for us to form conclusions and essentially become more intelligent. So being able to fully ingest a longer narrative of an idea and, like I said before, have ample time to rest and reflect on that particular narrative or those particular sources is of great benefit. And we have to question our value of a high volume of declarative information. And if you remember earlier from the prior lectures, declarative information means explicit information. So memorizing things, linguistics, things like geography or math, or remembering people's names in history, for example, in a history class. That's all declarative information. Or numbers or metrics or statistics or data. And we have to question our value of ingesting a high volume of only declarative information. We now know in neuroscience that declarative information is learned and processed, but we need time to integrate it into other cortical areas and other synaptic networks that involves things like non-declarative modalities, sensory experience, emotion, skills, social relationships, social relevance, and healthy behaviors. And none of those things really are in the same location of the brain as these declarative information, this data storage. I'm using some loose language there, but the point is you have to integrate that acceptance of new information with these more first-hand experiences that have to do with non-declarative modalities that engage the limbic system and engage things like movement and sensory experience and emotion and social connection. So a good example for that would be the public speaker Simon Sinek gave a really great example of a few years ago of teens and college students having a culture of sharing things with others with regards to the videos they saw, even though they didn't have direct first-hand experience with it, and providing the illusion to whomever they're talking to that they understand the experience. So, for example, if you watch a video of someone climbing a mountain in Colombia, you might have an illusory experience that you understand what that's like, but actually what you're doing is you're just looking at a two-dimensional representation of it. You're just basically looking at pixelated colors, and you're making some loose associations from your existing experiential repertoire. Now, if you replace that with actually going to Colombia and climbing a mountain, you just can't compare the two, and in fact, we're all guilty of it. There's an illusion that you can understand the experience from doing something like watching a video, even if you claim that it's not the same as going. And we have a culture of younger people who really can't understand the difference. They have trouble understanding the difference. So it's easy for us, perhaps those of us who are in our late 30s, early 40s, for example, to integrate smartphone usage or platform usage such as YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, into our lives because we had decades without it. But if you can imagine if you can imagine yourself, if you're of that age, being someone who's 16 or 17 in the present day, with all of these experiences, these iterated experiences, documented experiences being one touch away, you can imagine how disorienting and unhealthy that is. And one term that we use in psychology is the difference between direct engagement in behavioral psychology. The difference between direct engagement and what's called voyeurism. And voyeurism is the passive observation of something or someone when that something or someone is unaware that you're observing. So we call that voyeurism. And it's a very different process than being actively engaged with whatever you're observing in a two-way interaction. And we now know in learning science that, in fact, that is way more powerful for learning, and, of course, it has therapeutic effects on the nervous system, which we talked about in the applied neuroscience lecture. And there's also a great axiom that I think is relevant for this point. In neuroscience, we understand that natural selection requires that brain evolution needs to be achieved through behavioral success, because it's only through behaviors that the cumulative effects of a species' evolutionary specializations can be tested against the persistent challenges of changing environments. And there's a citation for that quote. And that's particularly interesting, and it supports this thesis that declarative information alone is basically useless without direct experience. Focus and concentration while in a relaxed state is also very advantageous and effective for learning, as well as creative. And a lot of this has to do with the autonomic nervous system, namely lowering sympathetic action, limiting your stimulus, and upregulating parasympathetic action in the right circuits at the right times. So in layman's terms, to feel a little bit more relaxed while you're in a state of focus and concentration. So let me try to be more specific about what a flow state is and how we can achieve it, and how do we define it? How do we know we're in a flow state? Well, let's take some examples from the neuroscience literature. Regarding flow states, findings already provide important insights into the crucial role played by higher order attentional networks and clear indications of reduced activity in brain regions linked to self-referential processing. And this quote came from a paper that also identified 6 phenomenological characteristics that are commonly present during what's been called a flow state. Now, just a reminder from the philosophy lecture, that's a big fancy word, phenomenology. What does that mean? That's the philosophical study of direct firsthand experience, or direct firsthand subjective experience as defined by the experiencer. So these 6 phenomenological characteristics that are present during a flow state experience, which I want to invite you to try to acquire in your day and week routine, are the following: hyper-focused, task-specific attention, the merging of action and awareness leading to total absorption in task engagement, the diminishment of self-reflective cognition and awareness of bodily processes, an altered perception of time, which again has to do with some of those neurotransmitters modulating, namely dopamine and serotonin, and a heightened level of task performance accompanied by a feeling of complete control and significant positive affect, including high levels of intrinsic reward, enjoyment, pleasure, and even euphoria, and even increased feelings of meaning and purpose. So, psychometrically, these 6 characteristics have become the way researchers both define and measure this flow state. I'd like to encourage you to try to experience and acquire by changing some of your behaviors that we're talking about today. And I would argue that something like excessive smartphone usage or excessive platform usage or excessive visual stimulus might discourage or downregulate. True intelligence comes from finding solutions to problems and synthesizing various ideas, lessons, facts, and perceptions that have made their way into our long-term memory. This is truly a cornerstone of humanity that is very difficult to do as a computer. Just to name an example, this is why it's so much easier to talk to a representative than to use an automated menu if you have a specific challenge, and possibly why we feel frustration with those automated menus. The business of taking in sensory information from the internet can cloud our ability to be calmer in a more contemplative state, which is a strong mechanism for learning and memory consolidation, especially the transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory. Or, for example, mental practice without prompts for studying, or mental practice without using your instrument if you're a musician for memorizing music. So sometimes limitation can create a strengthening for the brain. Distractions can also hijack a bit of important information and its voyage from short-term memory to long-term memory, which is called memory consolidation. The limbic system wants to react to stress. If you remember us talking about the limbic system during the applied neuroscience lecture, it wants to react to stress or sensory experience, but prefrontal cortex can battle this and override it. And one thing we should all be aware of is where our autonomic tone might be at any given moment or part of the day. And this determines what type of focus you have. And as we've covered, there's many different ways to induce changes into your autonomic tone. Whether you're in a state that's more sympathetic or a state that's more parasympathetic. Number 1 being activation and alert. The second one being passive and relaxed. And again, this will dictate how you process information. And again, I've argued that there's a chronic sympathetic activation in most of our population and a paucity of parasympathetic states. So we need to have alertness, which is usually moderated by epinephrine and norepinephrine, motivation and goals, which is usually moderated by dopamine, and attention, which works together with the first two, usually moderated by acetylcholine, another neurotransmitter, to successfully move forward, all driven by this executive function or top-down control. The alertness is the first step, the activation, and can come from a variety of things. Obviously, usually in the morning, we're rested. There's a small spike in cortisol. Maybe we have some caffeine. We do some exercise, so we get some sunlight. And then planning and moderating behaviors and mindset come after that process. But again, all of this is not valuable unless it's correctly balanced with parasympathetic state, typically in the evening, or perhaps various times during the day where you're more relaxed, calm, and passive. And curiously, visual focus largely dictates your overall focus and concentration. So be mindful of visual stimulus and take some time to limit your visual stimulus. So if we're going to talk about excessive stimulation, I would like to entertain the idea for a moment of the value of limitation. When a person is subject to limitations, the adaptation and adjustment process that takes place psychologically, physically, and behaviorally is key to learning and developing creativity and resilience, and growth and adaptation and general cognitive ability. When there's less limitation or more stimulation, more mechanisms of control are available in the environment, we will use them. And thus we have tremendous mental discipline. And as such, we will not have ingenuity. It's important to build focused attention, and to do so we need to remove possible distraction, including actually building behavioral structures, like, for example, turning off your phone or anything that brings you quick positive emotion, for example, or quick positive emotional reward, such as desserts or desserts within reach in the refrigerator, just to name an example. Sometimes listening to your intuition or making personal observations can be just as, if not more, important and accurate to your situation versus the desire or instinct to seek out answers and information with your phone, for example, or through elaborate sources of information. The value of mindfulness is a value of simplicity and subtraction. I have a friend who keeps his TV on all the time and claims that he needs a connection to the outside world. And of course, everyone's different, but that's really not true. It's just something that alleviates the discomfort of solitude and procrastinates the mental effort of focus, concentration. No one needs connection to exterior stimulus all the time. So let's talk about this idea of visual stimulus, habits, and associated health risks. Many people in the medical community consider smartphone addiction to be a public health problem, per the recent announcement from the Surgeon General. Generally, no more than 1 to 2 hours should a child spend on a device. And children under 2, generally it's recommended no screen time. And there's several different types of screen time in the research from the American Pediatric Association that are important to distinguish from one another. First one is educational content or age-appropriate entertainment. Second is content creation. The third is communication and correspondence. And the third, which likely is the most destructive and toxic psychologically, is passive engagement, such as scrolling on social media. Smartphone addiction has now been studied extensively and most certainly is a problem. Negative emotional variables were significantly correlated with smartphone addiction proneness in many studies, and many other negative consequences, such as, for example, interpersonal and academic problems, concentration problems, problems in cognitive skills, even obesity and sleep problems, and mental health and psychiatric illness. Especially with category number 4, social media usage or passive engagement usage. The trouble is one of the troubles is the way the brain and the nervous system's functioning by overuse of behavior, concentration, sensory stimulus, and psychologically. First of all, it's important to clarify there's no documented evidence for electromagnetic fields or radiation generated by cell phones posing a health risk. So I want to make sure that is not what we're talking about here. Nor does your smartphone or device increase your chances of cancer by any more than negligible amount. And of course, this is according to the NCI, FDA, and WHO. So let's talk about something we're all a bit familiar with, surfing on social media. It becomes a habit for many of us. It's a behavioral pattern. It's easy to fire. It's responding to visual stimulus and impulse versus impulse control. And it imbalances the dopamine system, which we talked about before. And it much in the same way that an addiction pathway works. It's also a substitute for social skills. And it's a substitute for a play-based childhood in the case of children. And children use play in order to develop socially and mentally and physically. And it's smartphone usage can be a substitute for play that involves physical movement, a creative movement, or something like rough and tumble play when children learn how to use aggressive behaviors to experiment with the limits of their safety and body, which, by the way, is actually important for development. It's also interesting to note that self-generating optic flow, meaning your visual field is changing due to a deliberate motion of your own body, is actually healthy and resetting for the nervous system. And when we're looking at a screen while our bodies are in motion, that's not happening. In a lot of these studies, better mental health was found correlated to less social media use, so there's an inversely proportional relationship there. Looking at something with busy visual or high cognitive stimulus in a small visual field versus a large visual field can generate overactivity in certain areas of the brain, and it's generally healthier for long periods of time to use a larger visual field, especially if you're engaged in changing your orientation deliberately. Studies also show greater reading comprehension and memory with reading books and paper versus reading the same materials on a smartphone. And again, this is likely due to how the visual system works with other areas of the brain, especially because we have a very small screen size. Also, what happens with children, preteens, and teens, especially among girls, curiously, is reputation sabotage, and things like cyberbullying. And this is a huge problem that's been correlated to a lot of psychiatric conditions as well. Another study showed clear degradation of white matter in the areas of the brain that involve attention, emotional processing, decision-making with people with internet addictions, and including discrepancies in the size of those brain areas. Another study yet showed people with internet addiction showing less efficiency in information processing and lower impulse control than normal controls by recording event-related brain potentials during a go, no-go task, which is a applied neuroscience research technique. People with internet addiction also have trouble multitasking and have trouble committing information to memory, either working memory or long-term memory. So once again, let's talk a little bit more about the neuromodulator and neurotransmitter and hormone dopamine, which we covered a little bit during the psychology literature and a little bit during the neuroscience lecture. Dopamine is one of the most important neuromodulators and neurotransmitters and hormones in most mammalian bodies, especially including Homo sapien. And it's key in how our brain and nervous system function. And it's of the catecholamine class, so the class of chemicals in the body that's generally responsible for activation and motivation and alertness and the activation of energy, especially in the morning. And let's talk about dopamine with special regards to behavioral tips. Generally, we all have to have good baseline dopamine levels. They can't be too low, they can't be too high. So ways to keep those levels stable are to avoid things that bring you direct pleasure all the time. So, of course, we can experience pleasurable things and rewards and desserts and our favorite TV show and et cetera, but only in moderation. And pick certain times where you're de-exposing yourself to that source of pleasure. When you're exposed to something or anticipation of something pleasurable, your dopamine system slightly upregulates. Now, if that process becomes chronic, that's one of the pathways for addiction. And what can happen, one of the many things that can happen during addiction neurophysiologically is a narrowing of the things that give you pleasure. So when you think about positive emotion or something pleasurable, the only thing you can think about is the focus of your addiction. And of course, for many people, it's alcohol. For others, it's opioids. For others, it's even things you wouldn't suspect, like certain foods or pornography or things like that, whatever the subject of the addiction is. Now, if you moderate and diversify the things that give you pleasure and satisfaction, you might generally have more positive emotion or more baseline mood in your life, or stable mood. And including pleasure as a result of patience and hard work is also very important for everybody. And this has to do with the catecholamines, namely dopamine, but also has to do with serotonin as well. And of course, it's very important for all of us to have a good baseline serotonin level in the body and brain. When we have a perception that a goal is being attained, especially if it has a social context or a social status marker, that's very healthy for our serotonin system. And self-regulation is very important. I've made this point many, many times in this video series and on my other videos. The idea of self-regulation and mindfulness work together. Creating a discipline with yourself that you can initiate a no-go before you engage in something you want, for example, or that you impulsively want to do. And a great example for this is always food. So we know that we have cravings for foods that taste good, but they're not always the best food choices. So if you can intentionally stop yourself from grabbing the dessert or something, or for me it's something at a party or at maybe a marching band banquet or something, and it's literally right within my reach of my hand. But when you engage that no-go and you say, use the impulse control to stop, that's healthy for the dopamine system. That keeps your dopamine system more balanced. Here's an interesting study. One study using an fMRI imaging, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging for the brain, showed people's reward centers, in other words, dopamine pathways, are much more active when they're talking about their own lives versus when listening to others. Very fascinating. So self-involvement that leads to pleasure also seems to be something that can destabilize dopamine. And it's clearly valuable to actively learn how to listen to others. You could also say that social media and the vernacular and the way that it functions mechanically feeds something like narcissism. 80% of interactions on social media platforms are generally about yourself or your own profile, whereas 30 or 40% are person-to-person interactions. So there's clearly a dopaminergic rewards of pleasure for interacting with content that has to do with yourself as an individual. I found that particularly fascinating. So let's take a moment to talk about what we call the digital age and how it might be impacting our behavior and lifestyle, which is somewhat of a philosophy topic as well. So we talked about the difference between stimulation and limitation and how both of them are valuable and important and how there's biological correlates to that. We also want to understand the difference between data and relation. It's a subject that's been interesting for me lately. So data is ingesting explicit information. And often we need to take time to use the existing information that we have and relate to others with it, which is a different activity than acquiring more data. And the psychometric literature would also say that maybe there's a masculine and feminine component to this. Masculine being more having to do with things, and feminine possibly having more to do with relationships or relation. And of course, many ancient civilizations will assert that we need masculine and feminine components in our society. So relation versus data, both are important. It's also really important to note that the acquisition of data and action are also two different things. So the acquisition of data and learning new things from exterior sources is very important, but putting that knowledge into action makes the knowledge valuable in some way. So we can't confuse acquiring more data as taking action on things. We all always take action, including very productive and virtuous action, with a limited amount of information. So we can't hesitate because we are always seeking out more data. We also need to explore this idea of data and meaning. And this has to do with the difference between something being explicit and implicit as well, which again is biological correlates when we were talking about the neuroscience topics. But we need to understand that data and meaning are also two separate things. And when you acquire more data or more information, you're absolutely not acquiring any more meaning. Meaning involves a separate inquiry and, of course, is very important and very valuable. There's also been a lot of correlations drawn to the epidemic of depression and anxiety and self-harm to a loss of meaning or a paucity of meaning. Next topic I'd like to go over with you briefly is something that's been talked about a lot amongst a lot of people, is the experience of brain fog or short episodes of brain fog. And it's a bit embarrassing to talk about because maybe some people think that there's something really wrong with them if they have some of these sensations, or maybe it means you're stupid or something like that. But it's actually a very common sensation, and it's a very common temporary condition that a lot of people experience at various times through the week and the day. First of all, it's this implicit thing we're calling brain fog is common in a couple of medical conditions, namely headaches, migraine, functional neurological disorders, post-concussion syndrome, depression, PTSD, or any kind of vascular issue or tension issue in the neck and the head that might interfere with circulation or perfusion. It can be associated with high stress or excessive stimulation in general, like we've talked about above. Anything that basically interferes with the metabolism of the brain and of executive function. So nutrition, all these things can have to do with it. We really have to remember that the brain is a physical organ, just like any other physical organ in our body, and it has temporary periods of functioning better and functioning worse, depending on the state that it's in that hour. So the brain is no different than any other part of our body physically in that way. And if you have the experience from time to time of brain fog, it has nothing to do with your IQ or how much knowledge you have. And curiously, I've seen this emerge in the literature a lot lately, and I've heard a lot of people just talk about it anecdotally, especially during the pandemic. And some people have unusual feelings from time to time, which can be described as dissociation or depersonalization or derealization. And those are pretty fancy psychiatric terms, but I just want to normalize that people experience these things temporarily, and they may not have the words for them, or they may be embarrassed to talk about them like they think something's wrong. But they're all relatively normal. For example, depersonalization sometimes can feel like you're observing yourself, or that you're listening to hear yourself talking like someone else is hearing it, or these very strange things that are hard to describe. And those of us who are tired or maybe, for example, are prone to headaches or things like that can experience these things. And they're just functional discrepancies in the brain. It doesn't necessarily mean something is really wrong with you. These types of episodes or sensations can occur more frequently with device overusage and video game overusage, for example, or even virtual reality usage. And there's certain things that can sharpen your metabolic function in the brain, like, for example, cognitive exercises, and they recommend these to seniors who are at risk for Alzheimer's. And we'll walk you through one of those in a minute. Or things like meditation. And we've talked a lot about meditation in a prior lecture, which stimulates the GABA system, which is an important neurotransmitter in the brain to help calm. It slows neural activity. And meditation will transfer control back to frontal brain areas if you're having uncomfortable sensations. And it allows you to adopt a perspective of a passive observer. It helps you become aware of distractions and monitor and compartmentalize undesirable emotions or emotional impulses. And of course, having good balanced diet and sleep will get the brain functioning generally better from hour to hour. Yes, the brain, just like your body does, because generally the physical processes that are happening inside of it are smoother and healthier and more balanced. Now, some people talk about brain fog relating to complex ideas like neuroinflammation or immune responses to certain foods, or ketogenic diets changing metabolism in the brain. Now, those are relatively complex issues, but the point is that these are physical things that happen and they can be temporary, no matter your level of IQ or knowledge or a mood state. So if you have brain fog of any kind, it's nothing to worry too much about, and it can improve with some of these tips. And a lot of these metabolic or vascular types of events are pretty transient and temporary. And if some of these things become a concern to you, you can speak to your primary care doctor or a psychiatrist. So just to review everything we covered today in our lecture entitled Stimulus, Concentration, and Cognitive Skills in the Present Day, we started by talking about this idea of experience saturation or overstimulation, which involves some neurology speak as well. We talked about flow states and repetition and relaxation versus stimulus overload. We talked about the neurobiology of stimulus and the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system, and how the dopamine system works in response to motivation and reward and pleasure and goals. We talked a little bit about the value of limitation, and we talked about visual stimulus and health implications. We talked about the digital age and how it's impacting our behavior and lifestyle. And finally, we tried to clarify what this term brain fog means, and provided some assurance that most of the time it's nothing to be concerned about, and that your brain, in fact, changes from hour to hour into how well it's functioning. So with that all said, I hope you found this lecture useful, and we're going to finish with some action items. So what can you actually do to take some of this new knowledge that you have into practice? How can you use it in your life to continue your journey with your employment, with your family, with your children, with your relationships, to hopefully make the world a bit of a better place? So here's a few things you could try. With regards to device usage, try to limit your device usage and make a routine that's conducive to doing so. So for pre-adolescent, generally less than 60 minutes a day. For adolescents, college, and adults, generally less than 2 hours a day. And again, that's an empirical figure. And you can customize your phone settings, or where even you keep your phone or your device or your laptop in your living space or your workplace, to help you with these habits. Not just for children, but for adults. Adults have behavioral habits too. So you need to set up good routines for yourself in that regard. Because excessive screen time, as we've covered, is very, very problematic. Number 2, take moments to take a break from what you're doing and try some what we call exercise snacks. Just take a break and walk up and down a flight of stairs, or do a quick errand, or do a few stretches. Just take breaks from what you're doing from time to time, not just for your body, but for your brain. Or just try silly things like choose 3 animals and try to say them backwards, or just try to memorize someone's phone number instead of inputting it into your contacts. This is very harmless types of things to do, and it will engage your cognitive skills, sharpen your concentration, help with your executive function, keep you centered and present, and help stabilize your dopamine system. All things that are healthy for you. Other things you can do for action items. Just take a few deep breaths. We could even try that right now. We do a nice inhale, a little pause, and then a longer, slower, deeper exhale. If you literally take just a few minutes in the middle of your day or on a break to do so, it will give your brain a chance to slow down and reconnect to center, and increase oxygen and blood flow to your head. Next thing is to set goals. Now, setting goals can improve focus and concentration, especially if we're in a state of overstimulation or taking in too much data, too many images, too many papers, whatever. Setting goals helps us ground us on how much we should do for a given day, so we're not just in a hamster wheel. And this is another reason to advocate for the value of obedience and respect of leadership too. And without getting into a philosophical discussion about that, it's really great if you're a young person to follow the instructions of your parents and your teachers to help you go to goals step by step, and to not get in too deep or overwork yourself past what your temporary goal should be. A few other action items for you. Try reading, ideally from a paper book. Try listening to books on tape, and instead of short 2 or 3 minute YouTube videos on a topic, try listening to a full podcast while you're in a flow state, like for me, maybe doing dishes or mowing the lawn, or listen to books on tape. Find a way during the day to keep your dopamine system in balance. For example, resist a temptation. If you know you can grab a dessert like we talked about before, just see how it feels if you use your impulse control and take a break from it. Another action item is an interesting one socially. Ask someone a conceptual question. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Ask someone a conceptual question. Try to engage in others from time to time, given it's socially appropriate, in a way that does not simply require quick and efficient exchanges of facts. So try saying things like in principle, or conceptually, or in general, without providing specific examples. Now, this will encourage a more implicit thought process about the given topic without the constant need for specificity or quantity of information. The next one is also social. Try to understand emotions. Try to get perspectives about how various ideas and interests are connected. Be creative with how you interact with others. Observe the natural chemistries that might come out. This is somewhat of a spiritual exercise, you could say. It does not have to do with acquiring more information, but again goes back to the idea of keeping relational dynamics in your life. And you could also try some cognitive exercises, like I said before. I want to remind everyone that this lecture has quite a few sources, and a lot of these things are not simply my own personal opinion, but are supported by literature, in many cases from peer-reviewed journals, and with empiricism. So this is a very big topic, and I want to thank you again for watching this lecture. I hope you got something out of it that's also useful and actionable. And please follow up with some of the sources if you want to learn any more about this really, really large topic. Thanks so much.